I have spent 42 years identifying the exact moment a system fails. In the world of forensic auditing, we call it the point of irretrievable variance. It's the second a ledger stops reflecting reality and starts reflecting a lie. I never expected to find that point in a recovery ward at 4:15 in the morning. The room was 55 degrees. Hospital air always carries the chill of a meat locker. My left shoulder, the one the surgeon had spent 4 hours reassembling, was screaming in a language I didn't yet speak. But it was the silence that truly hurt. I am Arthur Sterling. I have lived my life by the numbers. I know that a human heart beats approximately 4,000 times an hour. I know that a high-end private medical wing charges $2,400 a day for inclusive family support. And I know, with the cold clarity of a man who has audited 1,000 bankruptcies, that when you wake up from a grade A anesthesia, there is supposed to be a person in the chair by the window. The chair was a muted gray leather. It was empty. The plastic wrap from a sandwich sat on the side table, abandoned. I reached for my phone with my good hand. The screen was a graveyard of notifications. 14 missed calls. 6 text messages. All of them arrived after the surgery was completed. All of them arrived while I was in the black hole of the recovery room. I looked at the caretaker consent forms sitting on the foot of my bed. I had seen them sign these documents 6 weeks ago. Julian, my eldest, had used a Mont Blanc pen, his signature a sharp, aggressive streak of ink. Sloane had signed with a flourish smelling of expensive lilies. Leo, the youngest, had signed with the hurried scrawl of someone looking for the exit. They had signed a legal vow to be my primary post-operative support. In the eyes of the hospital, I was a man surrounded by a fortress of love. In the eyes of the auditor, I was looking at a fraudulent balance sheet. Mr. Sterling, you're awake. The nurse was a woman named Elena. She had the tired eyes of someone who had seen every version of abandonment the wealthy could provide. She didn't look at the empty chair. She knew better. Where are they? I asked. My voice sounded like dry gravel. They left around midnight, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Mr. Julian said he had a merger call at 6. Mrs. Sloane said the hospital lights were giving her a migraine, and the younger gentleman... She paused. He said you wouldn't be awake until noon anyway. I looked at the clock. 4:18 a.m. They signed the forms, I said quietly. They did, Elena replied. She moved to check my vitals. But Mr. Sterling, forms are just paper. You've been around long enough to know that paper doesn't sit in chairs. She was right. I had spent 4 decades proving that paper is often used to hide the truth. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of the 14 missed calls. They weren't calls of concern. I knew my children. These were check-the-box calls. Digital entries meant to prove they had tried to reach me, so that when they finally showed up at noon, they could blame me for being unavailable. In auditing, we call this creative accounting. You perform the gesture of the act without the substance of the effort. I felt a shift in my chest. It wasn't the surgery. It was a structural realignment. I realized that my children didn't see a father in this bed. They saw an aging asset, one that was taking too long to depreciate. Elena, I said as she turned to leave. Yes, Mr. Sterling? Could you bring me my briefcase? It's in the closet. There's a yellow legal pad inside. You should rest, Arthur. I've rested enough, I said. I have a ledger to open. I need to calculate the cost of 14 missed calls. As the door clicked shut, the silence returned. It was a heavy, shaped silence. It felt like the beginning of a long, cold liquidation. In my profession, you never look at a bankruptcy in isolation. You look at the 24 months leading up to the collapse. You look for the dry rot, the small, incremental decisions that signal a total loss of integrity. As I sat in that hospital bed, the yellow legal pad resting against my good leg, I began to map the dry rot of my own family. The audit trail began exactly 60 days ago, in my study at the Oak Hill estate. I had called Julian, Sloane, and Leo to the house for dinner. I told them about the degenerative condition in my shoulder and the necessity of the surgery. I watched their faces. An auditor learns to read the micro-lapses, the split second before a person adjusts their expression to match what they are supposed to feel. Julian, the CEO, didn't look at me. He looked at his watch. 6 weeks of recovery, Dad? He had asked. He wasn't calculating my pain. He was calculating the management burden. That's a heavy window. I have the Q3 earnings call right in the middle of that. I'm sure we can optimize the schedule, I replied. I used his language. It was the only way he stayed engaged. Sloane was the one who suggested the caretaker forms. She did it over a glass of $200 Sansere, her voice melodic and rehearsed. The hospital requires a designated primary, she said, leaning forward. We should all sign. It's a statement of solidarity. It tells the world and the doctors that the Sterling family is a closed loop. It was a beautiful sentiment. It was also an intangible asset, something that looks good on a balance sheet but has no liquidation value. She wanted the status of being a devoted daughter without the labor of being one. Leo, my youngest, had been the most vocal. Don't even worry about it, Pop. We'll be there on rotation. I'll handle the nights. I'm a night owl anyway. I remember looking at him and wanting to believe, but I also remembered his bank statements from 3 years prior, when I had quietly cleared a $40,000 gambling debt. Leo was a short seller. He bet against things, including his own promises, whenever the immediate payoff was higher. The signing of the forms happened 3 days later. I stood in the kitchen as they passed the clipboard around. It felt like a closing. I felt a rare warmth, a sense that despite the coldness of my career, I had built a structure that would hold under stress. We're in this together, Sloane had said, kissing my cheek. Her perfume was lilies, the scent of funerals, though I didn't think of it then. 42 days followed, 6 full weeks. In those 42 days, I received 14 status check emails from Julian's assistant. Not from Julian, from a woman named Sarah who worked for him. She wanted to know if the pre-op vitals were within parameters. Sloane called 4 times. Each call was a monologue about the stress of preparing for my recovery. She spent 20 minutes discussing the thread count of the sheets she was buying for my guest room. Sheets I would never see, because she never actually intended for me to recover at her house. Leo visited once. He asked to borrow my vintage Leica camera to document my journey of healing. He left with the camera, and I haven't seen it since. I sat in the dark of room 412 and wrote their names at the top of 3 columns on my legal pad. Julian, liabilities, false representation of availability, over-leveraged professional ego. Sloane, liabilities, performative empathy, fraudulent commitment to care. Leo, liabilities, asset stripping grat. Default on emotional debt. At the bottom of the page, I drew a double line, the universal accounting symbol for a final total. I realized then that the 14 missed calls on my phone weren't a mistake. They were a coordinated write-off. They had all agreed, perhaps subconsciously, that once the surgery was over and the crisis had passed, their presence was no longer required for the branding of the solid Sterling family. I looked at the phone. A new notification appeared. Julian, hey Dad, just saw you're out of recovery. So sorry I missed the wake-up window, got pulled into a global board meeting. Sarah is sending over a fruit basket. Talk soon. I didn't reply. I simply picked up my pen and added a single entry under Julian's name. Fruit basket market value, $60. Replaced value of father, unreconciled. The door opened. It was Alina again, this time with a tray of lukewarm broth. She looked at the legal pad. Working already, Mr. Sterling? I'm not working, Elena, I said, my voice steady. I'm performing a forensic post-mortem on a living entity. She set the tray down. Which entity? My legacy, I said. It appears it's been insolvent for years. I just didn't bother to check the books. I took a sip of the broth. It was tasteless. It tasted like the empty gray chair. It tasted like the next 13 days of my life. Recovery is not a linear progression. It is a series of stress tests. In the world of finance, a stress test determines if a bank has enough capital to survive a crisis. In the rehab wing of St. Jude's, my stress test lasted 21 days. The physical therapy was a brutal accounting of my own limitations. The therapist, a no-nonsense man named Marcus, pushed me to move a limb that felt like it had been replaced with rusted iron. He didn't care about my career or my estate. He only cared about the range of motion. It's about the mechanics, Mr. Sterling, Marcus would say, his hand steady on my walker. If the joint doesn't move, the muscle atrophies. If the muscle atrophies, the structure collapses. Simple physics. I appreciated Marcus. He was the only person who told me the truth about the load my body could bear. My children, meanwhile, were experts in creative reporting. Julian visited on day 4. He stayed for precisely 11 minutes. He spent 8 of those minutes on his Bluetooth headset, pacing the small linoleum floor of my room, discussing synergies and market volatility. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were darting toward the door. You're looking stable, Dad, he said. Stable. A word used for a dying stock that has finally stopped plummeting. Sloane says she's coming tomorrow. I've got Sarah looking into home care nurses for when you're discharged. Only the best. I didn't tell him that I had already spent the morning researching my own nurses. I didn't tell him that the best usually means the most expensive way to ensure you never have to see your father yourself. I simply watched the way his thumb kept twitching against his phone screen. He wasn't there, he was just maintaining a presence for the record. Sloane did not come the next day. She sent a voice note. Daddy, I am literally heartbroken. The recording began. I played it 3 times, not for the sentiment, but to listen to the background noise. I could hear the distinct clink of silverware on china and the low hum of a bistro. This migraine is just... it's a monster. I've been in bed in total darkness all day. I'll be there as soon as the light doesn't feel like knives, sending so much light and love. I looked at the window. The Kentucky sun was bright, unforgiving. I added a line to my legal pad, Sloane Sterling. Migraine. Background audio suggests a 1 p.m. lunch at Lee Avenue. Then there was the chair, that gray leather chair. For 21 days, I watched that chair. It became the most important metric in my audit. I watched the way the sunlight moved across it in the afternoon, highlighting the dust motes. I watched the way the nurses would occasionally move it to clean the floor, and then move it back. It remained empty. On day 12, I reached the point of total impairment. It was 2:0 a.m. The pain medication had worn off, and I was sitting upright, staring at the silhouettes of the medical equipment. I realized that my children were waiting for a settlement. They weren't waiting for me to get better. They were waiting for the estate to become liquid. They viewed my recovery as an inconvenient delay in the distribution of assets. I picked up my phone and called my personal attorney, Michael Vance. He answered on the first ring. He knew my habits. Arthur, he said, his voice raspy. It's 2 a.m. Is everything all right? The books don't balance, Michael, I said. My voice was a whisper, but it was the steadiest it had been in years. I've performed a stress test on the Sterling family, and the capital is gone. It was never there. It was all smoke and mirrors. What do you want to do? I want to initiate a full liquidation of the primary trust, I said. Every property, every portfolio, every intangible asset. I want it moved into a new vehicle. Something with restrictive covenants. The children won't like the fine print, Michael cautioned. The children haven't read the fine print in years, I replied. They only look at the bottom line. I'm going to give them exactly what they've been auditing, a final statement of their own worth. As I hung up, I looked back at the empty chair. For the first time since waking up to 14 missed calls, I didn't feel the chill of the room. I felt the quiet, cold satisfaction of a man who has finally found the error in the math. I wasn't a father in a hospital bed anymore. I was a liquidator. And the Sterling estate was about to experience a very thorough audit. I returned to the Oak Hill estate on a Tuesday, carried by a car service I had booked myself. There was no welcoming committee at the gate, no banners, just the heavy, silent dignity of the limestone walls and the scent of damp earth. I moved through the house with the mechanical precision of a man negotiating with a faulty structure. Every step with the walker was a calculation of weight and friction. I didn't go to the master suite. I went to my study. I sat in my leather chair, the one that had actually supported me for 40 years, and I waited for the performance to begin. It didn't take long. In the world of finance, when a major stakeholder moves, the market reacts. My children arrived on Saturday for what they called a welcome home celebration. Julian was the first through the door. He brought a bottle of scotch that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. He held me by the shoulders, avoiding the surgical site with a practiced, superficial caution, and looked at me with the intensity of a man closing a deal. "You look phenomenal, Dad," he said. "The sterling resilience. I knew Marcus would get you back on your feet." "Stability is a prerequisite for growth," I replied. I watched his eyes scan the room. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at the mahogany desk, at the safe behind the painting, at the physical manifestations of the wealth he had already spent in his mind. Sloane arrived 20 minutes later. She was a whirlwind of yellow silk and expensive apologies. She brought a catered meal, 4 courses of food I wasn't allowed to eat, and a mountain of recovery gifts that still had the price tags on them. "I've been so worried," she said, squeezing my hand. Her palms were dry. The migraines were just... I felt like I was in the ward with you, spiritually. "Does it still hurt?" "Only when I'm reminded of the absence of things," I said. She smiled, missing the point entirely. "Well, I'm here now. We're all here. We've even organized a schedule. We're going to be here every weekend until you're at 100%. Then came Leo. He didn't bring scotch or silk. He brought a business plan. He waited until we were halfway through the cold, catered salmon before he leaned in, his voice dropping to that conspiratorial tone he used when he was about to ask for a bridge loan. "Pop, I was thinking," he started, "while you were in the hospital, I realized how much I want to secure the family legacy. I've got this tech startup, logistics, real-time tracking. It's exactly what you used to talk about with your auditing. I just need a small infusion to get the seed round closed." I set my fork down. The sound of the silver hitting the china was a sharp, final note in the room. I looked at the 3 of them. Julian, the efficient architect of my abandonment. Sloane, the performative ghost of my recovery. Leo, the scavenger of my vulnerability. "It's interesting," I said, my voice low and measured. I spent 21 days in a gray leather chair. I had a lot of time to audit the real-time tracking of this family. "Dad, let's not get into that now," Julian said, his smile tightening. "We were busy. You know how the world moves." "I do," I said. "It moves according to the load it carries. And for 21 days, the load of my life was carried by a nurse named Elena and a man named Marcus. They are the only entries on my ledger that currently show a positive balance." The table went silent, not the respectful silence of a family reflecting, but the panicked silence of a boardroom that has just seen a disastrous quarterly report. I've decided to make some adjustments to the estate's distribution, I continued. I saw Julian's posture sharpen. I saw Sloane's hand move toward her throat. Nothing drastic. Just a rebalancing of the books to reflect the actual services rendered during the crisis period. Dad, you're just tired, Sloane said, her voice rising an octave. You're being emotional. I am an auditor, Sloane, I said, looking her directly in the eye. I am many things, but I have never been emotional. I am simply reconciling the accounts, and currently, you are all deeply in the red. I stood up, using the walker to push back from the table. I didn't wait for their excuses. I didn't wait for the I'm sorries that were already forming on their lips, words that had no collateral to back them up. I walked toward my study. Behind me, I could hear them whispering, not about my health, not about my pain. They were whispering about the adjustments. They were auditioning for a part in a play that had already been canceled. The following week was a study in desperate hospitality. Julian, Sloane, and Leo were no longer operating as children. They were operating as debt collectors trying to stave off a foreclosure. They hovered. They brought organic tea and expensive magazines. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones, as if I were a delicate glass structure that might shatter and take the inheritance with it. But on Thursday night, the pattern broke. I was in the garden, watching the sunset bleed over the Kentucky hills. The air was beginning to carry the scent of blooming dogwood, a sharp, clean fragrance that reminded me of things that grow without permission. I heard the crunch of gravel. It was Sloane. She wasn't wearing the yellow silk tonight. She was in a simple sweater, her face scrubbed of the performative glamour. She sat on the stone bench across from my chair. For several minutes, we simply sat in the fading light. I looked at the photos Elena took, she said quietly. Her voice lacked the melodic artifice of the previous Saturday. I didn't turn my head. Which photos? The ones of the ward. The empty room. She sent them to my phone after I called to check in on day 10. I think she wanted me to see what I was doing. Sloane paused, and for the first time in a decade, I heard a hitch in her breath that sounded like an actual human cost. I deleted them immediately. I told myself she was being unprofessional. But I couldn't delete the way that chair looked, Dad. It looked like a hole in the world. I watched a cardinal land on the bird bath. A vacancy is simply a statement of missing value, Sloane. It isn't personal. It's just a fact. It is personal, she whispered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I was afraid. Seeing you like that, it made the end of things feel too real. So I ran to a bistro and bought sheets I didn't need. I looked at her then. This was the reconciliation entry, the late arriving data that complicates a clean audit. In the competitor's story, the daughter apologizes, and the father says, I know, I am an auditor. I do not deal in it's okay. I deal in verified. I accept the apology, Sloane, I said. But you must understand something about the way I view the world. An apology is a narrative. A presence is a proof. You are providing the narrative 5 months after the proof was required. Does that mean the adjustments? She asked, her voice trembling. It means that the audit is complete, I said, and the findings are being codified as we speak. She stayed for another hour. We talked about her children, my grandchildren. We talked about the garden. She was, in that hour, genuinely lovable. She was the daughter I had built my life to protect. But as she walked back to her car, I didn't call her back to tell her I had changed my mind. You can love a person and still recognize that they are a bad investment. You can enjoy a sunset with someone and still know they aren't the person you want holding the light when the sun goes down. Julian and Leo called later that night. Julian wanted to discuss estate tax efficiencies. Leo wanted to know if I'd had a chance to review the pitch deck. I responded to both with full, grammatically correct sentences. I was warm. I was polite. I was the sterling resilience they so admired. I gave them nothing to fight, no anger to negotiate with, and no leverage to use. I was the perfect CEO of a company that was secretly being liquidated behind the scenes. The paperwork was finished. Michael Vance had the final signatures. The trap wasn't a cage. It was a mirror. On Monday morning, the books would be opened, and for the first time in their lives, my children would see the exact cost of a chair that stayed empty for 21 days. The morning of the closing was remarkably ordinary. The Kentucky air was still, and the dogwood had finally reached full bloom, looking like a dusting of snow against the green hills. I sat on my porch, a cup of black coffee in my hand, and a single manila envelope on the small table beside me. Julian, Sloane, and Leo arrived together. They had clearly coordinated. They walked up the driveway with the collective momentum of a board of directors coming to claim a victory. Julian was in his tailored charcoal suit. Sloane wore a muted, respectful navy. Leo had even tucked in his shirt. They looked like the children I had spent 40 years trying to build. "Morning, Dad," Julian said, his voice brimming with a hollow, professional cheer. Michael said the new trust documents were ready for a walkthrough. "They are," I said. I didn't get up. I simply tapped the envelope. "The audit is finalized. The entries are locked. All that remains is the distribution of the statement." I handed each of them a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a legal contract. That was already filed in Michael Vance's office. This was a summary of findings. I watched their eyes move. I have watched 1,000 CEOs read the news that their company was being seized. The pattern is always the same. Confusion, followed by a frantic search for a loophole, ending in a cold, hard realization of the truth. "The Oak Hill estate," Julian read aloud, his voice cracking, "is being converted into the Sterling Recovery Foundation, managed by a board consisting of Elena Vance and Marcus Thorne. The house is a large structure, Julian," I said, taking a slow sip of coffee. "It has 4 bedrooms. It spent 21 days with only one person in it. I've decided it should be repurposed for those who have no one to sit in their chairs. It will serve as a post-operative hospice for elderly veterans and those without families." "And the portfolio?" Leo blurted out, his face pale. "The liquidity?" "The liquidity is being moved into a restricted scholarship fund for forensic accounting students," I replied. "It is designed to teach the next generation how to identify hidden liabilities. Specifically, how to spot the difference between a performative asset and a genuine one." "Dad," Sloane whispered, her eyes filling with tears that didn't feel like the ones from the garden. "What about us? You said you loved us. You said you accepted my apology." "I do love you, Sloane," I said, and for the first time I let the weight of 72 years settle into my voice. "But I am an auditor. I believe in the integrity of the record. You are my children, and you will always have a place at my table. You are inheriting every Saturday morning I have left. You are inheriting the cornbread recipes, the stories of the bridge projects, and the garden advice." I looked at the 3 of them, the CEO, the socialite, and the scavenger. "But you are not inheriting the capital you refused to protect when the market was down," I continued. "In engineering, we don't reward a foundation that cracks under its first load. We replace it. I am not punishing you. I am simply balancing the books. You wanted the sterling legacy? This is it. A legacy of precision, consequence, and the cold, hard truth of a chair left empty." Julian started to speak, to argue about undue influence or mental capacity. But he stopped when he saw the look in my eyes. It was the look of a man who had already filed the paperwork, There was no room for negotiation. The audit was closed. They left an hour later. No scotch was opened. No catered meal was shared. The silence that followed their departure was different from the silence in the hospital. This wasn't the silence of abandonment. This was the silence of a house that had finally been cleared of its ghosts. The cardinal returned to the railing. He stayed for exactly 12 seconds this time. He looked at me with that frank, regal indifference, a creature that lived entirely in the present, unburdened by the debt of the past. I raised my cup to him. The shoulder still ached occasionally. The walker was still a necessity. But as I sat there in the April sun, I realized that for the first time in 40 years, the ledgers were perfectly reconciled. I had built a new structure, one that didn't rely on the dry rot of false promises. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. The books were closed. And I, Arthur Sterling, was finally truly solvent.